Russia, Moscow, early summer of 1993, the usual office of the special investigator Grigory Korolyov. On the wall, there's a large map of the capital and its nearby surroundings. Next to it stands a very tall, giant-built man, and a satisfied grin slides across his large face. "Here are my lands," he says to the king, pointing with his huge hand at the map. "Izmailovo, Kuntsevo, Losiny Ostrov. It's a pity there's no Odintsovo or Ramenskoye here." The investigator nods professionally and notes it in the report. Maybe this man was a gamekeeper protecting the Moscow region forests from poachers. No, the reclusive giant was hunting completely different prey.
"She has a head, a kerchief over her eyes, a dress of blood."
"I carry the head I cut off." He considered himself a being entrusted with the great mission of cleansing humanity from filth to create a new, better race. For this noble purpose, he used the method of reincarnation, which he himself invented. The method consisted of tracking down and taking the lives of people of non-traditional orientation. There were, however, some failures. The cleanser of humanity did not disdain old women, nor teenagers who happened to cross his path during his hunts, which lasted for almost 5 years. His most horrifying act was the execution of a defenseless elderly woman, which shocked even the most cynical investigators who had seen a lot in their careers. Upon discovering the maniac's next victim, forensic experts were initially unsure about the nature of the injuries. They hadn't yet found a fragment of an explosive device in the lower part of the body. The bloody messiah blew up a woman who was still alive by inserting a firecracker into her vagina, and the explosion tore open the poor woman's abdomen. Unfortunately, due to YouTube's censorship, I can't show some documentary materials, so I'll leave them out. Go to the Telegram channel Strashnoti, subscribe and watch. The link is below the video. So, from 1988 to 1993 in the forest park areas of the Moscow region, Izmailovo, Kuntsevo, and Losiny Ostrov, terrible discoveries were made, mutilated human bodies. The nature of the injuries left no doubt. It wasn't a wild animal attacking people who went for a walk in the forest park, it was a human who took their lives. The terrifying, logically inexplicable, and at first glance completely unrelated killings baffled even the most experienced investigators. This unknown criminal, the perpetrator, took lives and abused his victims using anything that came to hand, torturing people while they were alive and mocking their bodies in every possible way after death. The latter gave the maniac a special perverse pleasure. He would stick screwdrivers into different parts of human bodies, corkscrews into faces, shove ski poles into anal openings, cut off and burn heads, and even set off a pistol, firecrackers inside the bodies of people who were still alive. You are on the Strashnota channel, and today we will talk in great detail about the case. A fairly well-known maniac, but in reality you probably don't know much about him. The material is solid and factual. I'll leave the sources and additional materials in the Telegram channel Strashnoti, so give a like or a dislike, leave a comment and subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss new videos on the Strashnota channel. It soon became clear that there was not just a serial killer in the Moscow region, but a maniac pervert. He was distinguished by numerous perverted tendencies: necrophile, erantophile, itophile, icrophile, torturer. In short, a real combo. This man committed 18 proven murders and 2 attempted murders from 1988 to 1993, and there were also unproven episodes. For his bloody craft, he earned quite a few notorious nicknames. When shown a photo of one of his disfigured victims during interrogation, the accused asked for the picture as a keepsake. "She's so beautiful," he explained his request with a smile. This maniac was Sergei Vasilyevich Rikhovsky, born on December 29, 1962 and died on November 12, 2007 while serving his sentence in the Mordovian prison in the village of Sosnovka, Zubovo-Polyansky district, not living to see his 45th birthday. A little over a month later, on July 11, 1995, Rikhovsky was sentenced to death by shooting, but the highest measure was never carried out on him. The criminal and pervert died a natural death, but even hardened inmates were afraid of Sergei in prison. And even though it seems like I've already spoiled the whole biography of the maniac, the most interesting part is still ahead. Let's find out more about who Rikhovsky really was. So, the Balashikha beast was born in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in the Saltykovka neighborhood of the Balashikha district near Moscow. At that time, it was a suburban summer cottage settlement. The boy grew up in a complete, perfectly ordinary Soviet family. His parents were simple workers and did not abuse alcohol. They loved their son and cared for him in every possible way. Little Seryozha did not experience any horrors of a difficult childhood that could have affected his psyche. However, Sergei's development cannot be called normal or typical. By the age of 6 months, he already weighed 11 kilograms, while the normal range was around 6 to 9 kilograms. As a child, the boy was often sick, so his parents protected him a lot, and his mother's care was even excessive. His mother was very worried about her son's poor health, as he developed bronchial asthma after having pneumonia. That's why it got to the point where Seryozha was escorted to school almost until he graduated. The boy started speaking late, only at the age of 3. As it was later determined, Sergei's speech problems were caused by a birth injury, brain damage during passage through the birth canal, and mistakes made by the medical staff during the delivery. The baby was very large, but for some reason the doctors did not perform a cesarean section. As a result, the brain injuries had negative consequences for the infant's mental and physical health and led to delayed development. Moreover, a forensic examination would later determine that it was this brain defect that formed Rikhovsky's abnormal sexual tendencies. His mother adored her only child and took great care of him, but the excessive parental care, which everyone around noticed, naturally became a reason for mockery from his classmates. The child's especially unattractive appearance made things worse. At school, he was taller than all his classmates, and by adulthood, he had grown to almost 2 meters. Despite the fact that Rikhovsky had remarkable strength since childhood, he was described as withdrawn as a teenager since he hardly communicated with his peers and preferred solitude. His only real friends were animals, with whom he loved to spend his free time. By the way, this is for those commentators who write, "I love animals, but I don't like people." Well, Rikhovsky did the same thing. All of this together made the boy a real outcast. Classmates often laughed at Seryozha, whose mother literally walked him to school holding his hand for a very long time. His unusual appearance was also a subject of jokes, his stocky build and height of almost 2 meters. His classmates teased him with nicknames like Beanpole and others. Despite his physical strength and sturdy build, Rikhovsky was extremely sickly, which caused him to miss school often due to illness. Sergei grew up under his parents' overprotection, which meant he was hardly socialized, had no school friends, didn't know how to connect with people, and often got into arguments. As a result, he was completely unable to form lasting friendships or romantic relationships with them. He was both unsociable and withdrawn, quick-tempered, and perceived any aggression from others as an external threat. At the same time, according to Rikhovsky's relatives, in his early childhood he was also especially sensitive and impressionable. Later, his parents claimed that when he was a child, Sergei was very kind. They never noticed him hurting anyone, not even animals. On the contrary, he was very upset if something happened to his pets. Once the boy brought a kitten home from the street, but it soon got sick and died. Seryoja couldn't find peace and cried for a long time. He behaved the same way after the death of another pet, a parrot. The boy showed and affirmed kindness and interest in all kinds of animals, loved watching aquarium fish for hours, and spent a long time looking through albums and books about pets. There were always pets in the Rikhovsky family home, and little Sergei treated them with great care. But acquaintances of this family claimed that from early childhood, Rikhovsky was impulsive and aggressive and could lose his temper over any little thing that irritated him. Even then, signs of unprovoked aggression appeared. Sergei also struggled with his studies. He was a poor student and showed little enthusiasm for learning. The only childhood hobby not related to animals was radio. He tinkered with it somehow. After finishing 8th grade, the young man went to study at the Balashika Vocational School. After completing a year, he worked as an electrician at a scientific and production facility. Later, he changed a lot of different jobs, but never stayed anywhere for long, getting by with odd jobs, sometimes as a mechanic at a taxi depot, sometimes as a factory electrician or a security guard, but in reality, he lived off his parents' pension. In the evenings, he usually spent his time at home listening to the stereo radio. For the last 6 months before his arrest, Rikhovsky, although he wasn't working anywhere, almost every morning went out to his retired parents. He falsely claimed to work at a company, but actually went out to kill and steal money or property from victims, showing no hesitation. Rikhovsky's cultural level of development was extremely low, his communication skills were poorly developed, and even people who were well disposed toward him noted his rudeness, hot temper, stubbornness, and aggressiveness toward others. Physical development prevailed. Sergei was of impressive build and had a very large, awkwardly elongated head, which earned him one of his school nicknames, Hippopotamus. Later, when the police began searching for the newly emerged Maniac, his height and imposing physique became the main features in the wanted notice. Unsocialized and having no hobbies outside of his apartment. Rikhovsky was not literally obsessed with science fiction works about space, but he had read all the science fiction authors he knew, and as an adult, he wasn't particularly interested in anything else. Sergei wasn't interested in the opposite sex at all until he was 19, and throughout his life he only dated one girl whom he tried to awkwardly court. At 19 he liked a charming young lady with a great vibe, and with her he had his first and only more or less normal romance, or rather, a few dates. These relationships were purely platonic. Sergei would visit the object of his affection, give her flowers, and they would go to the movies together. But the girl's suitor's strange behavior scared her, so she avoided meeting him in deserted places. Later, she recalled that he was terribly hot-tempered and aggressive, almost attacking people and provoking them on public transport and in the street. He behaved like an animal defending its territory. After a short time, the young woman left Rikhovsky, and for Sergei, of course, it was a great shock. She later had a child with someone else. When Sergei found out about this, he was so shocked that he didn't even believe it at first, and when he realized it, he threw a wild tantrum at home. After that, he didn't even try to court girls anymore. It's quite likely that this unsuccessful experience with the opposite sex had a negative impact on the young man's psyche. His subsequent behavior indicated that the object of his desire had become older women rather than young ones. At the age of 20, according to Rikhovsky, he began to experience an overwhelming desire for intimacy with a woman due to the inability to fulfill his needs and sexual preferences. From March to November 1982, he committed 10 attacks attempting to assault elderly women in the Galyanovo district of Moscow. Thus, he first displayed his gerontophilic tendencies. On the 11th attack, the maniac got caught. His victim screamed loudly, attracting passers-by who subdued Rikhovsky and held him until the police arrived. Already on November 24, 1982, the granny lover was arrested immediately after attacking his 11th victim and was soon sentenced to 4 years in prison. But for some reason he was charged with malicious mischief, even though there were actual attempts at assault. According to the second paragraph of Article 15 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, as amended in 1982, an attempt to commit a crime is defined as an intentional act directly aimed at committing a crime if the crime was not completed for reasons beyond the control of the perpetrator. Most likely, knowing the customs of inmates, law enforcement officers simply felt sorry for Rikhovsky and didn't want to completely ruin his life, since there were attempts, but none of them were completed. Rikhovsky went to trial for the first time and was sent to a prison camp in the Saratov region. But his cellmates in the pre-trial detention center found out what the guy was really involved in and why he ended up behind bars and passed the news along to the colony. Rumors about his attempts to assault old ladies quickly spread in the prison among the newly arrived inmates. Such behavior was not only frowned upon, but was also punished with the full severity of the prison's own laws. They didn't stand on ceremony with such criminals in prison, regardless of their age. Sergei was humiliated on the very first day, and after that his prison life became a real nightmare. For all 4 years, right up until his release, he endured all kinds of humiliation, mostly of a sexual nature. This completely broke Rikhovsky's psyche. He served the full sentence assigned by the court. Upon his release in November 1986, Sergei left the prison zone. He was embittered, a fierce homophobe. The former convict now regarded gay people as a second-rate type of human and invented a mission for himself to cleanse the planet of them. The maniac believed that after death, members of minorities would be reborn and become heterosexual, that is normal, and he would be the new Messiah, the sole eliminator of society's filth. Once free, Rikhovsky came to 2 main conclusions for himself. The first was to leave homophobes alive so they wouldn't be able to identify him later. The second was that he should primarily kill gay people, combining, so to speak, the pleasant with what he considered useful for society. That's how the former convict came up with a plan to become a cleaner of the planet. After he was caught, he told the investigators, "One day I had a dream that homosexuals should be destroyed because they bring great evil." According to Rikhovsky, he lasted just over a year after being released. Attacks resumed in January 1988. So, on January 3rd around 9 p.m., Sergei attacked Margarita Georgievna T., who was waiting for a bus at the 11th kilometer Moscow Ring Road bus stop. Rikhovsky approached her, pulled her bag sharply toward himself, and stabbed her in the stomach with a pocket knife. After that, he snatched the bag. From the victim's recollections, when I ran out onto the roadway, I thought I'd rather be hit by a car than have him torture me. The victim survived and the perpetrator managed to escape. This episode was not even mentioned in court, according to Rikhovsky's testimony. 2 weeks after the failed crime, he attacked 20-year-old Svetlana near Golovacheva Street in the Kuzminsky Forest Park and struck her several times on the head with the back of an axe, causing her to lose consciousness. The reason why the criminal left her alive is unknown. This episode was also not included in the investigation materials. Thus, Rikhovsky's first several attempts to take a woman's life were unsuccessful, but soon he adapted and learned how to kill. Most likely, Sergei Rikhovsky committed his first murder in Bitsa on June 19, killing Anatoly Vilkin, a 41-year-old gay man he met at Estetika in Izmailovsky Park. The day before, he himself approached the young man and offered his intimate services. Rikhovsky immediately agreed and went with him deeper into the park. The maniac led the victim into the park, agreeing to the offer to have sex with him for money. But then, getting behind Anatoly, he suddenly stabbed him several times in the back with a screwdriver he had brought in advance, and after that, to make sure, he strangled the victim as well. After that, Rikhovsky undressed Vilkin and placed him on a stump in an indecent position across a fallen birch tree lying on the ground. As he later explained, he did this so that when the body was discovered, it would be clear that the deceased was of a non-traditional orientation. After studying Vilkin's biography, investigators found out that until his death, he tried not to publicize his inclinations, and none of his relatives or acquaintances even suspected the man's non-traditional orientation. Anatoly was married, he had an adult daughter, and on his last day, he was planning to go to the maternity hospital to see his newborn grandson. Even though the first body was found rather quickly, it didn't help the investigators at all. The criminal left neither traces nor clues. Now taking Rikhovsky and his life. Rikhovsky really liked it. He explained his behavior to the investigators like this. Before taking a life, something would just snap in my head. On July 4th, in the Podolsk district near Moscow in the forest, Rikhovsky stalked 70-year-old Klavdia Khrushcheva, who was walking along a path to her dacha. He followed the old woman to a deserted spot. He didn't even try to talk to her. He immediately attacked from behind and delivered 14 blows with a screwdriver. After that, he stole her war veteran identification and 45 rubles from Khrushcheva. Passers-by found her quickly and called an ambulance. The victim was taken to the hospital still alive. But she couldn't describe her attacker because she was attacked from behind and simply didn't notice the person who snuck up on her. The doctors were unable to save the elderly woman. She soon died from her injuries, which included damage to her heart, abdominal cavity, and chest. On September 8, Rikhovsky took the life of a 60-year-old woman named Prividentseva, also inflicting multiple wounds to her back and chest. This happened near the 58th kilometer of the Moscow Ring Road. She died from multiple stab wounds. The victim died at the scene, and the perpetrator went into hiding for several months. Rikhovsky, as before, remained extremely hot-tempered, taking out his bursts of rage on those around him without even trying to control himself. So, on January 2nd, 1989, the maniac committed his fourth spontaneous killing. While he was walking along a path in the park, he was accidentally bumped with a ski pole by 16-year-old Vitaly Zykov. The teenager didn't apologize for his clumsiness, which really angered the man. He caught up with the schoolboy near the 11th kilometer of the Moscow Ring Road and knocked him down. In a fit of rage, Sergei grabbed the boy, tightened a scarf around his neck, and committed a sexual act with the dead body. Then he pierced the teenager through the anus, using a ski pole as a suitable tool. This crime took place near a bus stop in the Losiny Ostrov forest area. The fourth killing became a clear sign of the criminal's final moral degradation, which progressed with each new episode. From this moment, Rikhovsky began to desecrate the bodies of his victims and then inflict post-mortem injuries on them. Moreover, the maniac dismembered the bodies and marked them. Not in order to make identification difficult or to hide evidence, he left the severed body parts at the crime scene or nearby. Sergei was never able to explain exactly why he did this. He took the skis of the deceased Zykov with him, but later threw them away at a distance of 500 to 800 meters from the crime scene. He didn't try to hide the teenager's body. The boy had gone skiing and never returned home. His parents began an active search and contacted the police. On the third day, the father discovered his son dead and mutilated. That's when investigators got their first evidence. A smudged fingerprint of the maniac was left on the ski pole, which provided a key to his identity. By analyzing this clue, the detectives realized that the attack was carried out by a tall and large-built man. Later, this assumption was confirmed when a man's glove, which the maniac had dropped in a hurry, was found at the scene of another murder. Despite this, all of Rikhovsky's crimes were not initially linked together, as the types of his victims were too different. For example, at first, the detectives mistakenly thought that another serial killer nicknamed Fisher, who also hunted teenagers in the Moscow region, was involved in Vitalik's murder. And there's also a video about this on my channel Strashnota. Only at the end of 1992, when the maniac Sergei Golovkin, also known as Fisher, was caught. It turned out that on the day Vitaly's life was taken, he had a solid alibi, and the investigation into this crime stalled for several months. But the strangest thing was that both maniacs lived almost next door to each other, literally just 300 meters apart. Although the forensic examination determined exactly that both Vilkin and Zaykov were attacked by a very large man, nearly 2 meters tall. For some reason, the experts concluded that even in these cases, we are talking about different people. For some reason, Soviet police officers were also convinced that the maniac would not change his preferences, and if he hunted boys, then women would no longer interest him. At the same time, there were already scientific works abroad about serial killers who committed crimes for the sake of the crime itself, for the sake of taking a life. And for them, the gender, age, and any other characteristics of the victim didn't matter. Sometime after the murder of the teenager, Rikhovsky, like many other executioners, wanted to return to the scene of the crime. Not far from the 11th kilometer of the Moscow Ring Road at a bus stop, he noticed a lonely elderly woman again. Rikhovsky attacked her and stabbed her with a knife. But the woman was saved by several layers of clothing, which made the wound not so serious. Trying to escape from Rikhovsky, the woman ran out onto the roadway while the criminal escaped. On March 11th of the same year, in Izmailovsky Park, Rikhovsky met a 42-year-old man named Mashkovich, who was of non-traditional orientation, and offered him intimacy. After agreeing, Rikhovsky lured his new victim into the woods, attacked him, and took his life with a terrible blow to the head with the back of an axe. His extraordinary physical strength helped the maniac deal with men quickly and easily. On May 30th, the maniac's victim was a 58-year-old woman named Bogdanova, who was killed in the Odintsovo district of the Moscow region. Rikhovsky's comb was accidentally left at the crime scene. The killer left traces all over the Moscow region, operating in different places, and the investigators, focusing only on their own districts, neither searched for nor seemed to notice a serial criminal in others. Even the testimony of the few survivors did not put the detectives on the right track. All the victims recalled with horror the attacker, a heavy-set man, about 2 meters tall with a harsh, menacing look. On June 9th, Rikhovsky's next victim was a 53-year-old woman who had come to a cemetery near Moscow to pay her respects to her recently deceased father. According to Rikhovsky's testimony, the reason for the attack was the victim's demand for payment for intimacy. On July 13th, 1990, in Izmailovsky Park, a 40-year-old woman was brutally killed. Her abdominal cavity was cut open and her head was severed and placed next to her body. A month later, in August, another woman was killed. She had previously spent a long time in prison and suffered from alcoholism. Her remains were discovered only nearly 2 months later, on September 24th. On February 22, 1991, another bloody crime took place in the Lyubitsy district of the Moscow region. The victim was 48-year-old skier Tatyana Norkina. The 2-meter-tall maniac stabbed her with a ski pole. A large men's glove was found on the deceased, which became another piece of evidence in the multi-volume criminal case. After his arrest, Rikhovsky asked to keep a photo of Norkina's body as a memento, calling her very beautiful. On August 13th, Rikhovsky committed another killing, this time of a 64-year-old woman. In the forest, he brutally beat her and slit her throat, then bit her entire body in a fit of uncontrollable animal urges. During the interrogation, he himself confessed that after the woman's death, he frantically bit her body. The woman's son filed a missing person report when she didn't return home from the country house. According to Rikhovsky, on July 13, 1992, he attacked a 72-year-old retiree, and after she lost consciousness from her injuries, Rikhovsky fled. For some reason, this episode was not considered in court. Later, Rikhovsky continued his crimes in Izmailovsky Park, where he looked for victims under the pretext of male-to-male sexual encounters. The Maniac's hunting grounds. Izmailovsky Park was not chosen by chance. This was exactly where men from the capital and the Moscow region with non-traditional orientation would meet or look for a partner. By this time, Sergei had fully embraced the idea of ridding the world of the blue evil. The Maniac used the simplest method. He lured his victims by pretending to be a gay man looking for a companion. That's how a 66-year-old non-traditional man, Nikolai Belkin, who had previously been convicted for shooting, fell into his trap. Those under 18. Rikhovsky took his life on September 7, stabbing him several times near the Oleni Pond. And in October, about 20 meters from the previous crime, he attacked a 38-year-old man who was also of non-traditional orientation. He cut off his genitals, then strangled him, and after that had sexual intercourse with the victim's body. Since Rikhovsky did not use contraception, investigators were soon able to obtain a sample of his semen. In November, on Losiny Ostrov in Metrogorodok, Rikhovsky killed a 14-16-year-old teen. According to the Maniac himself, he killed the boy because of suspicions about his non-traditional orientation. The boy allegedly offered him a relationship. After he strangled the child, he abused his body. The remains of the minor were discovered on April 20, 1993, during an investigative experiment. Even after Rikhovsky was arrested, the identity of the teenager could not be established, and the Maniac's involvement in this episode was not proven in court. Despite the homophobic campaign, Rikhovsky's attraction to elderly ladies did not leave him either. On December 15, he attacked a 61-year-old woman again, but she put up active resistance and started screaming loudly. This scared Rikhovsky, and he fled. And on December 16, he met 29-year-old Kamed M in a public restroom near Izmailovsky Park. According to the victim's mother, her son was born on the same day, month, and year. With Rikhovsky, the man allegedly offered him an intimate encounter in the forest. As with all his previous victims, Rikhovsky took his life and desecrated the body. Hamed's mother, through her sobs, said, "Before this I lost my eldest son. He was hit by a train. It's very hard for me. And then, 2.5 months later, this bastard took my last son from me. I don't want to live anymore." On December 25, Rikhovsky unsuccessfully attacked a 57-year-old woman named Firmanova, who was also skiing in the forest park. She managed to escape by putting up unexpected resistance. Here is how the victim herself recalled that attack. He seemed to appear out of nowhere, grabbed me, covered my mouth and said, "Be quiet, bitch." But the woman was no pushover, and with all her strength she bit the Maniac's finger. That is what saved her. He howled and jerked his hand away with such force that the victim, like a rag doll, was thrown toward Furmanov and was able to get a good look at the attacker. Using her description, police made a composite sketch of the attacker. On January 5, 1993, in a forest near the town of Elektrugli, outside Moscow, Rikhovsky took the life of 77-year-old Nikifor Andreevich Orlov, a veteran of the Great Patriotic War, whom he happened to come across while collecting firewood. Orlov tried to defend himself from Rikhovsky with an axe, but it didn't help him. The Maniac committed a sexual act with the corpse, cut off its head and hand, and threw them into the forest. The next day, he returned to the crime scene with a saw and for some reason also sawed off the corpse's leg.
The next day he came back here and found the corpse already frozen. I don't know why, but he took a saw that was lying nearby and sawed off its leg.
Orlov's son visited for Christmas and found a note on the table saying, "I'll be back soon." After waiting in vain for Nikifor Andreevich, he filed a missing person report at the Bykhovskoye police station. There, he identified his father from a photograph of a severed head with numerous wounds and abrasions. The grown-up son, crying after the criminal was caught, told the police officers, "My father fought in the infantry near Novorossiysk, was surrounded, and was wounded. He really wanted to see the 50th victory anniversary. If I were given the chance to carry out the sentence against Rikhovsky, I would shoot him without a moment's hesitation." In January 1993, the investigators finally got a reliable composite sketch of the suspected maniac, thanks to the help of Rikhovsky's surviving victim, that very same Furmanova. The woman had a photographic memory and described in detail the appearance of the maniac who attacked her. The officers, carrying flyers with the composite sketch, were now on duty in public transport and searching forest areas. The search area for the Balashika Ripper, that's the nickname under which Sergei Rikhovsky went down in the history of criminology, was gradually narrowing. On March 11, Rikhovsky dragged his new victim into an abandoned shed near the Rubliovka water intake, close to the village of Razdory in the Odintsovo district. There he tried something new. He subjected 55-year-old Olga Shparo to brutal torture, detonated a Corsair firecracker directly in her vagina, burned her hair, and stabbed a corkscrew into her face. Only after that did he take the victim's life, and then he desecrated the body. The criminal took the victim's bag and wristwatch with him. The woman's body, bearing signs of terrible torture, was discovered only 2 days later. The victim turned out to be an employee of Giprotsvetmet and a relative of the famous traveler and Donbass explorer Dmitry Shparo. While searching the area for possible evidence, the investigators came across another abandoned shed nearby, where they found a rope noose hanging from the ceiling. According to the investigation, this was preparation for the next crime, after which round-the-clock surveillance was set up on this shed. A clear fingerprint of the maniac was found on the glasses of the deceased Shparo, but it will only be possible to identify him a month and a half later when Rikhovsky is already caught. It's very strange, because Sergei's fingerprints should have already been in the Ministry of Internal Affairs archives after his first conviction. Thanks to Furmanova's testimony, the investigators got an approximate profile of the Balashika monster. The search was supervised by Nikolai Chekmazov, who later headed the criminal police near Moscow. He suggested that the maniac might return to the same area again, since they are often drawn to the scene of their last crime. In April 1993, there were several more incidents from the same series. The perpetrator, who was later identified as Sergei Rikhovsky, committed new brutal murders. 14-year-old Rinat Kairulin, a student at a boarding school for children with intellectual disabilities, became one of his April victims. The boy, unfortunately, picked up a wallet that Sergei Rikhovsky had either accidentally or intentionally dropped, and returned it to its owner. Sergei thanked the child and started talking to him. When he found out that the boy was having trouble with his homework, the criminal introduced himself as someone who could help with math problems and lured the boy into the forest. There he brutally beat and strangled Kairulin, then abused the body and dismembered it. Rikhovsky cut off the victim's head and threw it 40 meters away from the body, then burned it on fallen branches. After that, he made a fire nearby and burned his victim's textbooks. Later, the criminal could not explain his actions. What he did made no sense and only confused the investigators. On April 12, a day before his arrest, Rikhovsky took the life of another person, 62-year-old Anna Narcission, who tried to defend herself from him, first with a pepper spray, then with an awl. It only disoriented the attacker for a couple of seconds, after which he attacked the woman again. In desperation, Anna tried to stab the maniac with the awl, but Rikhovsky easily snatched it from her hands and used it to take her life. After Anna's death, he, as usual, committed an act with her body, and in addition, he wrote "Greetings from Chechnya" on her body with lipstick. With a deliberate mistake, trying to mislead the investigation, creating the impression that the crime was committed by Caucasians as part of ethnic cleansing. These last two victims were discovered after Rikhovsky's arrest on April 13, 1993. The police set up an ambush at the place where Olga Shparo's mutilated body was found on March 9th. The day after his latest crime, the maniac went to the shed where he had prepared a gallows for a new victim, but there he was met by an ambush. The investigators determined that not far from the place where Olga was killed, a large man resembling the composite sketch was seen by a passerby. The police officers decided not to rush to arrest the suspect, but wanted to approach him carefully to test the waters. One of them called out to the man, "Excuse me, do you have a light?" But Rikhovsky, as soon as he saw the strangers approaching him, sensed danger and immediately started to run. The police officers quickly caught up with the maniac, but they couldn't manage to restrain him. The giant, weighing almost 1.5 centners, put up a fierce resistance. Only when his pursuers drew their service weapons was Sergei forced to surrender. They managed to put handcuffs on him only at gunpoint. That's how, during the chase and under threat of physical force, Rikhovsky was detained. In his pocket, they found a piece of rope from which the previously discovered noose had been made. Sergei Rikhovsky was arrested at the end of April 1990, but he began taking lives in January 1988, meaning his bloody path lasted more than 5 years. During a search of his home, they found a squirrel pocket knife, which he used to attack his victims. At the very first interrogation, Rikhovsky didn't try to deny it and confessed to taking the life of one of the women. He initially denied the other crimes, but that changed as soon as he was brought to the crime scene for a reenactment of the killing of the 13-year-old teenager. There, Rikhovsky unexpectedly began confessing to other crimes. I decided to show 3 more crime scenes nearby. At the Powerline Junction, I killed and raped a girl. About 300 meters past the junction, an elderly woman was killed, and an elderly man was too early last December. While already in Lefortovo prison, Sergei Rikhovsky confessed to all his crimes, even those he was not suspected of. He was later identified by the survivors. A few days after his arrest, he led the investigators to the body of his last victim, as well as to the corpse of a teenager who had been killed. In November 1992, and on May 5, 1993, during investigative experiments, Rikhovsky himself led the investigators to the decapitated body of Khairulin. Despite his confession, the maniac showed no remorse. Moreover, he enjoyed looking at photos from the scenes of his crimes, where the people he tortured were captured. The killing of children and the elderly, who apparently were not part of his plans to cleanse the planet of homosexuals, Sergei tried to justify by claiming he had some kind of blackout in his mind. Like many serial killers, Rikhovsky kept a diary where he recorded his killings and attacks in detail. He recorded distances to various cities in the Moscow region and ticket prices there, and he marked the death of each new victim with a little coffin drawn in red or blue, depending on the gender of his latest prey. In addition to hunting people, Rikhovsky had another hobby. He was writing a science fiction work called Starfall, in which he described the daily life of a future state security officer nicknamed Commandor. This very officer carried out sweeps of planets and pirate spaceships, clearing them of all sorts of riffraff. He used for his own purposes a group of robots under his command, space pirates, bandits, as well as women of easy virtue and men of unconventional orientation. Commander would burn them with flamethrowers or throw them out into open space. Rikhovsky especially enjoyed describing the executions carried out by the great Commandor. After death and reincarnation, all the bad and dirty ones would be reborn as fully fledged, useful members of society. Rikhovsky wrote as many as 3 versions of this thrilling story, but he never finished any of them. According to psychiatrists, he simply didn't know how to end his thrilling narrative. In the criminal case opened against Rikhovsky, one of his science fiction stories is still kept, richly supplied with illustrations he drew himself, featuring starships and laser guns. It describes in detail the deeds of the great commander in organizing the Interplanetary Federation, raising a new generation, and creating a society where the weak are subject to destruction for subsequent reincarnation. The maniac committed his crimes with full confidence in his righteousness, as shown in the operational video footage. I'll leave the Adobe materials in the Telegram channel. There's a lot to see there because documentary footage has been preserved. The link will be under the video as explained. In the same way, I consider homosexuals and prostitutes to be abnormal people. They can be corrected through reincarnation, and I see this as my highest mission. Most of the maniac's victims were women who were about the same age as the criminal. If not old enough to be his grandmother, then definitely his mother. Their ages ranged from 52 to 73 years old. But Sergei didn't limit himself to this group, since he was a maniac with a broad profile. 5 men and 3 teenage boys, aged 13 and 15, died at his hands. Almost none of them could effectively resist Rikhovsky. With his height of 2 meters and weight of 135 kilos plus his explosive temperament and unhealthy tendencies, his victims practically had no chance. During the psychiatric evaluation, Rikhovsky was found to have a whole range of inclinations, including gerontophilia, sexual attraction to the elderly, anchorophilia, a tendency towards sadism, and a syndrome of inability to distinguish sexual objects. Most likely few people have heard of this. It's an attraction regardless of age, gender, or appearance, caused by organic brain damage. However, despite this, Rikhovsky was found to be sane, which caused him great indignation. The defendant himself even promised to generously reward the investigator if he helped him get sent to a psychiatric hospital. In his note from the detention center, which was also added to the case materials, Rikhovsky promised to give the investigator a foreign car if he managed to have him declared mentally ill. But despite all the tricks, the criminal was found sane. No one wanted to hand over the maniac. After that, Rikhovsky withdrew all his statements, claiming that they were obtained under pressure from the investigation. During the October events of 1993, when a coup took place in Russia, Rikhovsky wrote a letter to Alexander Rutskoy, in which he presented himself as a victim of the anti-people government. In 1995, the Moscow Region Prosecutor's Office sent an unprecedented case to the regional court, accusing a resident of Balashikha of 19 murders and 5 attempted murders. It was proven that the accused experienced sexual attraction to corpses and, mainly because of this, strangled and cut his victims. But he himself, as has been said several times, explained his actions by hatred toward women of easy virtue and people of non-traditional orientation, men who, according to him, were all among those he killed. And he justified the attacks on teenagers and people aged 60, 70 by claiming temporary insanity. Rikhovsky still considered himself a true fighter against gays. After all, there were 5 male victims aged from 29 to 60. He met almost all of them in Izmailovsky Park, a traditional meeting place for people with non-traditional orientation. According to Rikhovsky, one of them tried to kiss him, to which the criminal reacted with disgust, "Go kiss your own death." According to the prosecutor's office, some of the victims were indeed known to have non-traditional inclinations, and one of them, whom I mentioned earlier, had been convicted of corrupting minors. But other men, for example, a war veteran who was gathering firewood in the forest, obviously did not fit into Rikhovsky's system of struggle in any way. The Balashikha maniac himself insisted on being tried by a jury. In front of them, he clumsily tried to present himself as a victim of the political regime and argued that his case had been fabricated. But for some reason, what seemed to the defendant like a clever move didn't work. It was a terrible trial. The relatives of the victims were fainting almost every half hour, and the men were all trying to rush toward the bars where the accused sat, sullen and glaring from under his brows. Even the usually unflappable guards were clenching their jaws in hatred this time, listening to the long descriptions of the maniac's hunts. As a result of the lengthy trial, Sergei Rikhovsky was found guilty of 18 out of the 19 murders he was charged with. His involvement in the killing of an unidentified teenager in November 92 was not proven, nor was it proven in the 2 attempted murders. 3 other assault episodes, which Rikhovsky confessed to in court, were not considered. On July 11, 1995, the court sentenced him to death by shooting. The audience greeted the verdict with applause mixed with curses directed at the maniac, but the convicted man was not fazed by this. Moreover, when he was being led out of the cell, he suddenly turned to the people and shouted twice, "I'll be back, I'll be back." There was something eerie and prophetic in that phrase, as many people thought. Once in the death row cell, Rikhovsky began to write petitions for pardon in batches. And while the papers were making their way through various authorities, 1996 came when a moratorium on the death penalty was announced. The Balashikha maniac was never executed because of the introduction of the moratorium and certain nuances of criminal law, which includes the principle of retroactive effect for amendments that improve the situation of convicts. The sentence he received was replaced with life imprisonment. In 1999, Rikhovsky was transferred from Butyrka pretrial detention center to a colony for life prisoners, where he continued to write his memoirs, imagining himself very much in the spirit of his main character, the commander from Starfall, a kind of noble sufferer misunderstood by humanity. On the pages of that science fiction story of his, Seryozhenka, as investigator Beloturov called him, described the same thing in various ways. The unyielding commander destroys the bad guys in every possible way, throwing them into open space, tearing off limbs, blowing them up, quartering them, burning them. Maybe he believed in the possibility of posthumous reincarnation for himself too. At first, the maniac was placed in a cell with 2 murderers, but they were very frightened of their new cellmate, started calling their cell cursed, and tearfully begged to be transferred to another one. That's how Sergei landed in solitary. In his last years, the Balashikha Ripper spent his time in a Mordovian correctional colony, staying in solitary confinement. Rikhovsky was sent to the Mordovian colony. His cellmates were afraid of his gloominess and called him a ghoul, a mute, Satan, and a psycho. He spent whole days reading books by Isaac Asimov, Ray Bradbury, Robert Sheckley, and other science fiction writers, as well as writing fantastic real memoirs. By the way, notice the benefits of reading books. This person read, and not bad literature either. He both read and wrote. Only Sergei Kvastunov found a common topic to discuss with Rikhovsky. The topic was astronomy. They discussed the stars, and Rikhovsky touchingly read science fiction to Kvastunov at night. Rikhovsky's relatives showed no interest in his fate. His mother never visited him, even though he wrote her many letters. Only journalists occasionally showed interest in the infamous maniac. By a strange coincidence, Rikhovsky was serving his sentence in cell number 33. Just like Chikatilo, it was there, in the Novocherkassk detention center, that the Rostov killer awaited the court's decision on his pardon. But unlike Rikhovsky, he never received a pardon. Strashnota already has, or will soon have, a detailed video about Chikatilo. Be sure to watch it. Type Strashnota Chikatilo to search for it. When the heavy iron door of the cell in Mordovian correctional colony, one creaked open, only a thick grate made from heavy rebar separated the reporters from the bloodthirsty serial killer. Just like in court, Rikhovsky looked at all the visitors from under his brows, and his gaze was filled with undisguised hatred. At the same time, you could also notice a flicker of hope in his eyes, that maybe the journalists taking his picture would want to interview him. Whatever it is, it's still entertainment for a lifer, right? But not every reporter was eager to talk to such an unusual character, which often greatly disappointed Rikhovsky, who was hoping to make some money from his interviews. But even if journalists did talk to the criminal, they flatly refused to pay him a fee. Then the maniac spent a whole year complaining to the prison administration and lamenting his hard life because of the stingy reporters who not only didn't give him any money but even refused to send him a food parcel, at least a pack of tea or some cigarettes, he whined resentfully like a little child. Apparently Rikhovsky was counting on a less boring life after being caught, instead of worldwide fame and having all his whims fulfilled. In exchange for the interview, he got a strict daily routine: wake up at 6 in the morning and lights out at 10 at night. Moldovan prisoners were only allowed 1.5-hour walk in a cramped stone enclosure. When he was taken out of the cell, the once feared murderer had to stand humbly, bent over with his legs spread wide, waiting for the handcuffs to be put on him. He was also brought back closer to the year 2000. Rikhovsky was already quite a pitiful sight with his size and inhuman appetite. He, like a wolf, was constantly hungry and ended up losing 15 kilograms. Taking away an extra portion from Rikhovsky was especially risky at first, since there was only one other person in the cell with him who was serving time for taking the lives of 3 people. At the same time, neither of the cellmates received any parcels, since their relatives had disowned them. Rikhovsky only liked to read science fiction, so serving a life sentence was extremely boring for him. Like many inmates, he also didn't find faith. That's why, from the monotonous, strictly regulated prison life, the maniac grew fat from boredom and completely degenerated. One day, before the arrival of another group of journalists, the Moldovan prison decided to carry out disinfection, for which they sent all the inmates' clothes for a 3-hour heat treatment. During this time, inmates covered themselves as best they could, some with blankets, others with newspapers. An improvised loincloth was made, and only Rikhovsky and his cellmate strutted around in front of each other. Just as they were born? When the guard looked through the peephole of cell 33 that day, he burst out laughing. Giant Rikhovsky and his 1.5-meter tall short cellmate were marching around naked in a circle, steam coming out of their mouths. Later, Rikhovsky himself wondered how he managed to stay on court for so long. The regional police officers most likely decided that 4 years in the harsh conditions of the colony had reformed the rapist Rikhovsky and cured him of the insatiable sexual drive he complained about in a letter to the prosecutor general, sending Rikhovsky to prison for only 4 years. Actually, not even for the assault, but for just attempting it. They immediately forgot about him and didn't monitor his further path and behavior when he was released. But Rikhovsky didn't take any special precautions. He didn't change his place of residence. He should have been under special supervision. Given the nature of the crimes committed, the police could have easily found him in the same Izmailovsky Park where the maniac regularly visited, or in the Ramensky district. From the pattern of the crimes, it was also possible to guess that they were committed by the same person. However, during all this time, the detectives only became interested in Rikhovsky once, detaining him on suspicion of a murder committed by someone else. At that time, he kept quiet about his hobbies and was soon released. It would later turn out that a little more than a year had passed since Rikhovsky returned from prison after serving his first sentence. When the district officer summoned him and, knowing his ward's weakness, warned him to do whatever he wanted, just not on his territory, Sergei promised to comply with the request. The police and prosecutor's office showed an extreme level of negligence in this case. The regional police officers themselves were convinced that if Rikhovsky hadn't confessed to so many murders, they still wouldn't have been solved. Notably, in one murder case, the criminal case was closed, and in another, the district prosecutor's office lost nearly all the evidence. In several cases of Rikhovsky's failed attempts, the victims didn't even go to the police, simply not expecting any help from them. Only after being caught in April 1993 did he sincerely confess to everything. Moreover, Rikhovsky even told the prosecutor's office about several crimes that were never fully solved, since the victims' bodies were never found. No one had reported these people missing to police. The Rikhovsky case was handled by Mikhail Belaturov, a top investigator at the Moscow Regional Prosecutor's Office. He was very polite with the maniac. So as not to accidentally anger or scare off the criminal, the investigator protected him from other suspects and made sure he was kept in a cell with only a few people. A note found with Rikhovsky in the detention center, in which he offered the investigator a foreign car, caused confusion and a smile from Belaturov, since, according to available information, the criminal didn't have a penny to his name. Belaturov believed that Seryozhenka, as he called Rikhovsky, deserved the death penalty and believed until the end that the jury would not waver. That's exactly what happened. They lived up to those expectations. But then there was the moratorium. Sergei Rikhovsky represents one of the most complex and deviant personality types in the history of domestic criminology. His case is a tragic intertwining of organic brain damage sustained at birth, profound social maladaptation, and the development of a sadistic necrophilic complex against a backdrop of total loneliness and rejection by society. Since childhood, Rikhovsky suffered from the consequences of a birth injury which caused delays in his speech and mental development. Overprotection from his mother, combined with ridicule from his peers because of his unusual appearance, formed in him a deep inferiority complex and chronic aggression. He was an outcast, unable to form normal social or romantic relationships, which led to his sexual drive shifting into the realm of gerontophilia and later necrophilia. The key turning point was his first conviction and subsequent imprisonment, where he was subjected to cruel treatment and sexual abuse. This not only broke him completely, but also formed a fierce homophobia in him, which he rationalized as a mission to cleanse the world of gays, through depriving them of life and reincarnation. This pseudo-messianic idea became the central justification narrative for his crimes in his own mind, although in reality he deprived many people of life, elderly people, teenagers, random passers-by. Rikhovsky combined traits of both organized and disorganized criminals. He carefully planned his hunts, chose locations, pretended to be gay to lure his victims, but at the same time acted impulsively under the influence of sudden bursts of rage. His actions after taking lives, desecrating corpses, dismembering bodies, and defiling them indicate deep necrophilia and sadism. He derived pleasure not only from taking lives, but also from having total control over a lifeless body. At the same time, he kept diaries and wrote fantasy stories in which he projected himself as a commander and punisher, cleansing the universe of filth. This indicates the presence of a complex system of delusions and attempts to compensate for his own inferiority through fantasies of power and the right to pass judgment. Despite multiple paraphilias and organic lesions, he was found sane as he was aware of his actions and could control them. His attempts to manipulate the investigation, give false testimony, and demand to be declared insane, all this indicates preserved critical thinking and the ability for strategic behavior. In the end, the personality of Rikhovsky is a unique blend of biological deficiency, social isolation, prison trauma, and a constructed ideology of violence. He was not insane in the classical sense, but his psyche was so distorted that taking lives and abusing his victims became his only way of self-realization and compensation for total existential failure. But his story is also a reflection of the system, which failed to recognize the threat in time and did not prevent a series of monstrous crimes. Prison, by the way, is meant to rehabilitate, not to punish, to reduce the number of repeat offenders. That's what prison is for. On November 12, 2007, Sergei Rikhovsky died in custody from advanced pulmonary tuberculosis. Terrible crimes attract public attention much more often than good deeds. That's why the maniac Sergei Rikhovsky and his crimes have been the subject of numerous films, television shows, books, and even a long video on the Strashnota channel. Are you watching it right now? And you probably even shared it with someone who might be interested, and most likely you also liked it and left a comment. In 1995, a documentary called The Rikhovsky Case, The Silence of the Lambs, was filmed as part of the Criminal Russia series on NTV. And in 1996, the film Inhumans was released by the Ministry of Internal Affairs Television. The book Maniacs in Moscow from the Nightmares in Moscow series was published, compiled by Maximovsky and Ryabinin. In 1997, the books Maniac Ripper from Balashika by Marina Bernatskaya and Maniacs, Blind Death by Modestov were published. There's only a small section about Rikhovsky. The rest is an anthology on other maniacs. Here's how he remembers the case and meeting Rikhovsky. This horrifying story first unfolded before my eyes. On March 12, 1993, I was sitting at the Operations Communication Console, next to the duty officer of the Moscow Region Criminal Investigation Department, Pyotr Alexeyev. Glancing at the facts that had come to life, my companion suddenly grunted, and after waiting for the message to be received, handed me the paper. They come up with things like blown up genitals, but it's probably just a stab wound. However, the detectives who arrived at the scene saw something they had never seen before. The body was found in a shed about a kilometer from the southern gates of the Rubliovka water intake facility. The forensic expert determined that the unknown woman died from a rupture of her genital organs, where an explosive device had been inserted. But that's not all. The victim's body showed signs of brutal beating, the hair on her head was burned, and there was a stab wound gaping near her mouth. Forensic experts suggested, and this was later confirmed by the perpetrator, that a sharply pointed corkscrew had been twisted into the woman's face. By the way, most of the victims met their deaths in places where they had been dozens, or maybe even hundreds of times before. The deceased Enna had a dasha in Malakovka, lived there for many years, and loved to walk in Lishak. Two women who died at the hands of the maniac grew up as neighbors and walked that very road, which became their last, almost every day. I happened to see Rikhovsky during a trip to the Podolsky district, where, at the scene of the 70-year-old woman's death, he was giving testimony that was being recorded on video. We drove for a long time, rattling in an old minibus. On the way back, Rikhovsky, in his usual manner, sat hunched over, staring gloomily out the window. Finally, we reached Silikatnaya station. What next, Sergei? Asked investigator Mikhail Beloturov. Rikhovsky glanced around, as if he'd slept through the trip, and waved indifferently. That way? Are you sure, Sergei? Just so there are no problems later, Beloturov doubted. From the station, I took a bus for 3 stops. Then, answered the guide, let's go further, moving along the highway away from the railroad. After about 10 minutes, Rikhovsky perked up here. We got out and continued on foot, observing all the formalities of the investigative experiment, and explained to the cameraman that we would now proceed on foot. We went through a settlement. Rikhovsky stopped, looked around, searching for signs only he knew, and led the group on. After passing through the settlement, we found ourselves at the edge of a field, beyond which a forest loomed in the darkness. Rikhovsky confidently continued along a path trodden between the gardens. A brief historical digression is needed here. After Chikatilo was caught and the investigation began, the group responsible for security faced a very specific problem. During trips to the crime scenes called walkouts, the suspects are handcuffed to the escort officer with one hand. Usually this kind of connection doesn't really tire out either the arrested person or the guard from the convoy unit. Distances are usually short, and the walkout happens once or twice. But in the Chikatilo case, there were about 100 such walks, and sometimes they had to move off-road for distances up to 5 kilometers. Plus there was heat, nerves, and fatigue. Even though the guards switched out, often taking turns handcuffing themselves to Chikatilo, they still complained their hands aren't made of iron, and the bruises wouldn't go away for a week. The suspect was in an even worse situation. The only thing he could do was switch hands, and then someone came up with an original solution to the problem. A single detail was added to the standard handcuffs, a long steel cable, which made it possible to increase the distance between those chained together and thus provide more freedom of movement. People stopped tugging at each other during walks, especially long ones, and their hands hurt less. Chikatilo wore these same handcuffs while walking around the Rostov region. These same personalized bracelets, as Deputy Chief of the Moscow Criminal Investigation Department Vladimir Tsky called them, were put on Golovkin for Rikhovsky. The personalized ones were kept at the Ministry of Internal Affairs Museum, where this unique exhibit was a highlight of the display about the Rostov murderer. But let's get back to the Podolsk district. When they approached the forest, Rikhovsky spoke up again. There's a small clearing there, and across the path there are some fallen logs. To clarify, there refers to where the Ripper attacked the old woman, strangled her, and stabbed her in the chest. His loot was a shopping bag and some food that the old woman had bought at the Selpo store. Rikhovsky didn't have time to assault the victim. He told the investigator he was scared by a noise and fled into the forest. They went on, and Rikhovsky walked confidently, as if there should be a special sign or a gravestone there that you simply couldn't miss. Time passed, but the clearing with the fallen logs was still nowhere to be seen, so they stopped. Mikhail Beloturov, for whom the accuracy of the investigation experiment was more important than for anyone else present, didn't rush Rikhovsky. He just carefully asked, "Sergei, are we taking the right path? You're not making a mistake, are you?" The men took a smoke break. The maniac kept glancing sideways from under his brows, not smoking. He didn't have any bad habits at all. They started walking again. Finally, the path curved and we found ourselves in a sunny clearing. To the right, there were piles of felled pine trunks. We stopped. The cameraman approached Rikhovsky and the investigator got ready to ask questions, but the maniac calmly looked around and said, "This isn't the place." Then Beloturov got a little worried. "Look carefully, the logs, the clearing, are you sure you're not mistaken?" But Rikhovsky didn't make mistakes. We were convinced of this a few minutes later when, after walking another 400 meters, we came out onto the next clearing. It looked exactly like the previous one. The only difference was that this was the place where Rikhovsky had taken a life. He had a phenomenal memory and knew many areas around Moscow, especially those where he hunted people. Among Rikhovsky's personal belongings, they found several maps that he used to plan his upcoming trips. He even kept a kind of diary of his crimes until his death. The detectives found a thick notebook with an original drawing on it, a human skeleton holding a knight's shield, and on the shield there were little squares drawn. The investigators puzzled over what they meant for a long time, and then suddenly realized that each square was a stylized image of a coffin. That's how he marked the death of each new victim. In 2000, the film Sentence to Live was released, and in the same year, the film Don't Execute My Killer was made. In it, Rikhovsky gives an interview in the pretrial detention center of Butyrka prison, where he claims his innocence. In 2002, a news segment about Rikhovsky was shown on Channel 1. In 2004, the film Diagnosis Maniac was released, and in 2008, the program Maniac Hunters was broadcast on Channel 1, which used footage from the news broadcast of March 15, 2002. In 2009, the program Vesti Nedeli showed footage from the news broadcast of March 15, 2002. In 2010, the program Documentary Investigation showed an interview with Rikhovsky that he gave in a Mordovian prison in 2000. In 2011, in the series of programs Sledstvi Veli, there was a segment called My Name is Starfall. In 2013, the program Legends of Soviet Investigation showed a segment called The Bloody Mission of the Commander. In 2015, footage from the program My Name is Starfall was used in an episode of Good Morning on Channel 1. In the same year, episodes 21 and 22 of the multi-part feature film Profile of a Killer 2 were dedicated to Rikhovsky.